I found myself wide awake at exactly 5:07 a.m. A sudden roaring sound came from outside, a deep rumble like someone was revving an engine on my front lawn. My heart lurched because there shouldn't have been any vehicle out there at that hour. I stumbled toward the window, almost colliding with the dresser in my haste, then peered outside and felt my stomach twist. Headlights beamed across the grass. The silhouette of a mid-sized BMW SUV occupied the very spot where my sprinkler once stood. Right in front of me, in the damp glow of pre-dawn light, a figure pressed the gas pedal slightly and pivoted around as though my lawn were nothing but a vacant lot. My throat went dry. The brazen disregard for my property stunned me speechless. Moments later, the car whirled away and disappeared down the street. That was the beginning of what would become a tangled war with not just the driver, but with the entire HOA. I need to clarify, my neighborhood isn't some shady corner of the city. It's what people typically consider an attractive suburban development. You'd see rows of pastel houses with matching mailboxes, gardens filled with bright perennial blooms, and driveways so clean they could be mistaken for showroom floors. Everything looks in perfect order, at least on the surface. Under that neat exterior lurks the entity known as the Homeowners Association, or HOA. Most folks assume an HOA just enforces guidelines about hedge height or mailbox colors. And to be fair, ours has done some decent work in maintaining the overall aesthetic. But they also hold a level of power that can be unnerving if someone decides to use it the wrong way. I hadn't had a single argument with them in my 3 years living here. I always kept my lawn mowed, my trash bins discreetly placed, and my front porch devoid of any questionable decor. So it shocked me when I discovered that an HOA official, specifically a woman we all called Karen, though her official name was Valerie Karen Brown, had commandeered my lawn as her personal turnaround spot. Initially, I didn't even recognize her in the driver's seat, but a neighbor who caught a glimpse of the same SUV vehicle and the puzzle pieces fell into place. When this violation happened for the second time, I grabbed my phone and raced outside in pajamas, intending to confront the driver. Yet by the time I managed to fling my front door open, the car was gone. It left deep tire tracks like ugly scars on the damp soil. I walked over to inspect, stepping gingerly so my slippers wouldn't get soaked. Seeing the damage up close stoked a surge of anger in my chest. The grass had been uprooted in patches, soil clumps scattered like fresh craters on the moon. It was no simple matter of someone nudging the lawn. This was intentional, or at least reckless enough to look that way. I gritted my teeth, none of it made sense. My property line meets the sidewalk with a clean border. To drive onto that patch of grass, she would have had to steer several feet off the street. Nobody does that by accident twice. So I did what any rational, mildly panicked homeowner might do. I set up a security camera that same day. The angle wasn't ideal, but it covered most of the front yard. I figured if it happened again, I'd have proof. And sure enough, barely 2 days later, my camera caught a crisp shot of the same BMW turning across the corner of my yard at around 5:15 a.m. It paused briefly, as though the driver was checking if I was watching, then it picked up speed. Once more, I woke up to deep tracks on the grass. The imprint so pronounced that one of my solar lights lay snapped in two. The footage was no cinematic masterpiece, but it was enough to confirm the license plate. I muttered a few choice words, then replayed the clip. Even in the grainy pre-dawn footage, I could make out Karen's face through the windshield. She didn't look guilty. If anything, her expression seemed bored or mildly inconvenienced, like she had every right to cut across my lawn to avoid making a standard 3-point turn in her own driveway. You might wonder why I didn't just knock on her door that same morning. I admit, I thought about it, but something about the brazen way she'd committed this act, coupled with the knowledge that she held a high position in the HOA, made me wary. The HOA has a history here of slapping people with obscure fines, twisting regulations, or even threatening legal action if residents violate certain covenants. Having an HOA official mad at me didn't exactly feel like the best scenario. However, doing nothing wasn't an option. This was my property, and she was trespassing. So I spent the rest of the day drafting an email to the board. I politely explained the situation, attached a screenshot of the footage, and asked them to step in or at least advise Karen that her behavior was unacceptable. I pressed send, half expecting some immediate apology or reassurance. 3 days passed without a response, except for a short automated message acknowledging they'd received my complaint. Meanwhile, I discovered fresh tire marks nearly every morning. Some days they appeared shallower, as if she barely grazed the edge. Other days they gouged deep furrows that made the yard look like a miniature dirt track. My frustration ballooned. I began losing sleep, waking up in the dark just to peer out the window, hoping to catch her in the act. Yet somehow she managed to time it so I never saw her directly from my vantage point. That camera footage became my lifeline, each day revealing the same SUV, the same brazen violation. On the 5th morning of this nonsense, I woke to a letter in my mailbox from the HOA, but it wasn't about my complaint. Instead, it stated I was in potential violation of the community's landscaping standards because my lawn exhibited excessive wear and tear that detracted from neighborhood aesthetics. Ironically, it included a threat of a $200 0-cent fine if I didn't repair the damage within 2 weeks. I reread the letter at least 3 times. The sheer gall was astounding. They were fining me for the destruction caused by one of their own members? My anger mixed with disbelief, and I marched back inside to draft a far less polite email. This time I attached multiple video files, screenshots, and a copy of the HOA's own guidelines that should, in theory, protect me from such a ridiculous penalty. My phone rang the next day, and a voice that introduced itself as Darlene from the HOA administrative office asked if I could come to their scheduled meeting on Thursday evening. She sounded apologetic, which caught me off guard. I expected hostility, or at least formality. I agreed to show up, relieved that perhaps reason would finally prevail. On Thursday, I arrived at the community center, a nondescript beige building near our local park, and found about 15 people gathered in a small hall with folding chairs. At a long table sat 3 individuals, a balding man in a navy blazer who introduced himself as Martin, the HOA president, a stern-faced older woman named Paula who handled finances, and Karen, who gave me the faintest nod of acknowledgement. The meeting droned through a few standard agenda items, a new regulation about holiday decorations, a discussion about communal flower beds. Then Martin invited me to speak about my complaint. I stood up, feeling my pulse throb in my temples, and calmly explained the entire situation. From the repeated long damage to the silent response to my emails. Karen sat there, flipping through some papers, not looking me in the eye. Paula wore an inscrutable expression. Martin frowned a bit, then asked if I had any proof. Yes, absolutely, I said. I have multiple video clips and snapshots. I handed them a folder with printed stills, each clearly showing the BMW's license plate and Karen behind the wheel. That's when Karen cleared her throat, finally directing her gaze toward me. She said, I admit to turning around near your lawn, but it's right by the curb. If your property were better maintained, it wouldn't be so easy to drive on. And also, I believe you've altered the footage. It seems suspicious. Her words rendered me momentarily speechless. The audacity to accuse me of tampering with footage. Before I could retort, Martin frowned at her. Wait, he said. Are you denying that you drove across his property or just questioning the extent? Karen shrugged. I'm saying it's an overreaction. The man's front yard is practically muddy. If I did cross it, it was minimal. My frustration boiled over. Minimal? I have to replace sod weekly, my sprinkler head got crushed, and the HOA itself threatened to fine me for the damage. At that, Paula leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. "Let's not escalate," she said softly. "We're here to mediate. Possibly we can find a solution. Maybe partial compensation for repairs if Ms. Brown is indeed at fault." Karen shook her head. "I see no reason I should pay anything. He's the one with an unkept lawn, and quite frankly, if he's planting fragile lights or sprinklers right by the curb, it's his responsibility." I realized that logic wouldn't stand in any normal setting, but this was an HOA hearing, and Karen wielded influence. Martin sighed, flipping through the pictures. "We do have guidelines about maintaining a presentable front yard. Perhaps the easiest route is to have our landscaping subcommittee look into possible modifications for your property so cars don't accidentally drive over." He said that so casually, as though the real solution was for me to adapt my lawn to accommodate random vehicles. I nearly laughed. Instead, I politely reminded them that trespassing is illegal and that no homeowner should be forced to re-landscape just because someone felt it convenient to cut across. But the body language in that room told me everything I needed to know. Karen was part of their inner circle. They'd find a way to spin this. Sure enough, by the end of the discussion, Martin concluded that no official disciplinary action would be taken against her since they had inconclusive evidence regarding malicious intent. I left that meeting with a swirl of anger and despair clouding my thoughts. My property had become a battleground, and my attempts at a peaceful resolution were being laughed at. A faint glimmer of hope remained in the possibility that they might refrain from enforcing the ridiculous fine. Yet the very next day I received a second notice from the HOA, stating that the $200 0 penalty was confirmed, giving me a deadline to pay or face further action. My rage sharpened into something akin to cold determination. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. I spent the better part of the week searching for legal precedents in my state, specifically about HOA disputes and property rights. I found a few relevant cases, but none involving a board member actively damaging someone's yard. Nonetheless, I compiled every piece of documentation I had, from the earliest photos of tire marks to the final notice of the fine. I also took the time to speak with a local attorney, who offered a free consultation and advised me to gather more definitive proof. "Catch 'em in real time," he suggested. "If they keep crossing your lawn, maybe you can get a clear video or even file a police report for trespassing." In the meantime, Karen continued her pre-dawn or late-night escapades, leaving me fresh evidence of her brazen shortcuts. The camera caught her SUV on multiple occasions, but either the angle wasn't perfect or the lighting was poor. I needed something undeniable. That's when I decided to install a second camera concealed behind a decorative bush aimed directly at the problem spot. It had infrared capacity and a motion sensor, which would hopefully yield clearer images. As I set it up, I felt a pang of absurdity. Here I was, crouched in my own front yard, trying to outmaneuver an HOA official who couldn't be bothered to drive an extra 20 feet to use her own driveway. Then came a twist I didn't anticipate. One morning, around 6:30 a.m., I heard the usual engine roar, accompanied by a screech that sounded like metal dragging across something solid. I bolted outside, camera phone in hand, in time to see Karen's SUV lurch off my grass. She must have hit a hidden sprinkler pipe or an edging stone. She opened her door slightly, glanced down, then slammed it shut and sped off. My phone camera managed to catch the tail end of it, and I snapped a few pictures of the fresh track that glistened with what looked like a small trail of leaking fluid. I groaned. This was going to escalate the conflict even more. If she damaged her undercarriage, I suspected she might try to pin that on me somehow. Sure enough, the following day I received a letter titled "Formal Complaint from Ms. Brown." She alleged that my yard posed a safety hazard to vehicles, that I had deliberately left obstacles near the curb and that I should be held liable for any damages to her car. The letter ended with an ominous statement: "Should you fail to remedy these hazardous conditions, the HOA reserves the right to impose stricter sanctions or initiate legal proceedings." I laughed bitterly as I read it. The boldness of that threat was mind-boggling. It became clear that Karen was determined to make me the villain in this narrative, possibly to deflect attention from her own trespassing. My mind wandered to extreme ideas, installing spike strips or tall metal fences, but obviously that would be illegal, or at least frowned upon, and I didn't want to risk harming anyone physically. Instead, I sought an alternative solution that wouldn't violate any local statutes. After some research, I came across a forum discussing creative ways to protect property from unwanted vehicles. One suggestion involved using specially designed plastic ridges that are buried just below the surface. They don't have sharp edges, so they won't cause lethal harm, but they're enough to jolt a car's suspension if someone tries to drive over them repeatedly. Before implementing anything that dramatic, I consulted a friend of mine who dabbles in landscaping. He told me that as long as the plastic ridges are classified as landscaping enhancements and not purposely hidden hazards, it could be legal in our jurisdiction. Of course, the HOA might interpret it differently. Still, I reached a point where the idea of letting Karen trample my lawn any longer was unbearable. One Saturday, I woke up before dawn, dug shallow trenches in the trouble spots, and installed the ridges. I covered them neatly with turf, making sure they were practically invisible to an untrained eye. It took me several hours, and by the time I finished, my clothes were muddy, my back ached, and I felt a twinge of guilt. Part of me worried about damaging her vehicle more severely than intended, but I reminded myself she had no right to be on my grass in the first place. The next morning, I barely slept, anticipating the sound of her engine. At about 6:22 a.m. I heard it, a loud clunk followed by a scraping grind. My heart pounded as I peeked out the window, just in time to see her SUV bouncing awkwardly, the front wheels reacting to the hidden ridges. She slammed the brakes. The car rocked for a second, then reversed. A faint hiss of steam or smoke rose from underneath. Karen stepped out, planting her high heels on my lawn, then yelled something unintelligible while examining the ground. I held my breath, making sure my window blinds were only slightly parted so she wouldn't spot me. She crouched, touched the turf, then stood up abruptly, her expression livid. For a split second, I wondered if she'd march up to my door and start banging, but instead, she got back in her SUV and drove off slowly, leaving a fresh set of scuffed tracks that revealed nothing of the ridge's presence. Later, I checked the new camera footage. It captured everything crystal clear: her car's abrupt stop, her exit, her furious pacing. This was it. Proof, not only that she was trespassing again, but that she found something under the grass. I expected immediate retribution, maybe a new wave of fines or a letter claiming I'd created a dangerous device. Yet 3 days passed quietly. No notices, no knocks on my door. I began to feel hopeful that maybe, just maybe, Karen had accepted defeat. Perhaps that harsh jolt taught her a lesson. Maybe she realized continuing this behavior would only cause her more trouble. My relief proved premature. One afternoon, I opened the mailbox to find an envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed note reading, "Remove your illegal spikes or face legal action." That was all, no signature. I suspected Karen but couldn't be sure. Then, 2 mornings later, the real blow arrived in the form of a thick packet from an attorney's office representing Karen Brown, stating that I had willfully and maliciously installed harmful obstacles on my lawn, causing damage to her vehicle, and that she intended to sue me for repair costs plus damages for emotional distress from driving over my property. My outrage soared to new heights. By then, I had also begun noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood's atmosphere. A few neighbors who used to wave at me in passing started avoiding eye contact. Maybe they heard Karen's version of events, or maybe they feared involvement. One older couple, however, discreetly approached me one evening while I was watering the front hedge. They admitted they'd seen Karen's SUV cutting through my lawn on multiple occasions and offered to provide statements if needed. I thanked them profusely. Their testimony could be crucial. Another neighbor, a woman named Clara, whispered that Karen had a reputation for bullying tactics. "She practically runs the HOA," Clara said. "Be careful, she can make your life miserable if you don't toe the line." I shrugged, already in the thick of it. There was no turning back. With the lawsuit threat looming, I called my lawyer. He reviewed the complaint, then examined my video evidence and the photos. "You have a strong defense," he noted. "Your property is not a public thoroughfare, and you used non-lethal, non-sharp ridges. She shouldn't be driving there, period." He also suggested we countersue for trespassing and property damage, especially since we had multiple documented instances. I felt a surge of relief, but the stress lingered. Lawsuits are time-consuming, potentially expensive, and unpredictable. The fact that Karen was entangled with the HOA might complicate matters further. Sure enough, the HOA soon announced a special meeting to discuss landscaping hazards in the community. The official notice mentioned concerns about concealed devices that could harm vehicles or pedestrians. Though it didn't name me directly, the implication was clear. When the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into the community center with my head held high, armed with my lawyer's guidance. The room was more crowded than usual, likely due to the sensational nature of the conflict. Karen sat at the front with Martin and Paula, and a few other board members I barely recognized. Murmurs rippled through the audience as I took a seat in the second row. Paula called the meeting to order, then announced an agenda that listed my case under new business. Martin addressed the room. "We've received reports of a homeowner installing unauthorized structures on their property, posing potential risks. We need to determine if this violates HOA guidelines." He looked directly at me. Karen maintained a smug expression. Paula asked if I'd like to speak. I rose from my chair, every eye in the room upon me. "I'm happy to clarify," I said. "These so-called structures are plastic ridges placed within my property lines to prevent continued trespassing by a certain individual. I have evidence that Ms. Brown has been repeatedly driving across my lawn." A rumble of whispers swept the crowd. Karen stiffened. "Your lawn extends too close to the curb," she snapped. "It's practically part of the roadway." I couldn't believe her argument. "No," I replied, holding up a printout of the official survey map. "The boundary is clearly defined. You have no right to be there unless invited, and if you damage your vehicle while trespassing, that's on you." Paula tried to regain calm. "Let's keep this civil," another board member, a stoic man named Gerald, leaned forward. "Couldn't you have installed a small fence or reflective markers instead of something hidden?" I explained that fences can require permits and tall markers wouldn't solve the problem of someone intentionally ignoring them. But I said, if Ms. Brown had the decency to use the public street or her driveway, none of this would happen. I'm not the one intruding on someone else's property. Martin cleared his throat. "We have to consider the safety aspect. If anyone is injured, the HOA could be liable for not enforcing guidelines." My patience frayed. "Then enforce the rules on the person trespassing," I nearly shouted. "You're focusing on the effect rather than the cause." The tension was thick. Karen's face had grown red, her jaw tight. She launched into a tirade about how she's an upstanding board member, how she's done so much for the community, and how my defiance threatened the spirit of neighborhood unity. I let out a bitter laugh, unable to contain my incredulity. Neighborhood unity? You've levied fines against me for damage you caused, threatened me with lawsuits, and manipulated the board to side with you. That's not unity," the audience muttered, some in agreement, some uncertain. Paula looked uneasy. Martin glanced between Karen and me as though he wished he could vanish. Eventually, the board decided to table the discussion, stating they'd review all documentation. That meant no immediate resolution. I left the meeting exhausted but not defeated. At least the entire neighborhood now knew what was really going on. A few days passed in relative calm, but then I discovered that someone had uprooted a section of my front lawn again. Not by driving over it, but by literally digging up a patch of turf about 2 feet wide. My second camera caught a figure in the middle of the night, face obscured by a hood, using a shovel. The sabotage made little sense, unless it was a petty attempt at intimidation. I reported it to the local police, though they said it would be difficult to identify the culprit without better footage. My lawyer added this incident to the growing list of harassments. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to suspect Karen or someone loyal to her. Meanwhile, the attorney representing Karen actually followed through with preliminary steps for a civil lawsuit, demanding I remove the ridges immediately and pay for the thousands of dollars in damages to her vehicle's undercarriage. My lawyer responded with a sternly worded letter detailing her repeated trespassing, our video proofing, and the neighbors willing to testify. He even threatened a counterclaim for harassment and property destruction. Part of me felt a tinge of fear at the prospect of a lengthy court battle, but another part felt vindicated. I had the truth on my side, and if she wanted to escalate, so be it. Then came a development I never saw coming. One early morning, while checking my cameras to see if any more trespassing happened overnight, I noticed something bizarre. Karen's SUV didn't appear, but around 2:00 a.m., a different car stopped near my curb. 2 individuals got out and walked around the corner of my yard, shining flashlights. They lingered for about 5 minutes, then drove off. The next day, I found small wooden stakes hammered into the ground on the city-owned strip just beyond my property line. A tiny piece of survey tape fluttered from each stake. When I asked around, I learned from another neighbor that the HOA was considering a minor road expansion project, possibly involving a new curb alignment. There were rumors that Karen was deeply involved in pushing that plan. If the city or the HOA decided to shift the curb, my property line might effectively shrink, giving them a rationale to claim that corner of my lawn as some communal right-of-way. That revelation brought a new layer of complexity. If they managed to reclassify part of my lawn as city or HOA territory, then my ridges could be deemed illegal structures on communal land. Worse yet, I might lose the entire argument by default, because you can't claim trespassing if the area is considered public or semi-public domain. My lawyer said this was reminiscent of the strong-arm tactics HOAs sometimes employ, aligning with local officials or city planners under the guise of improvements. He advised me to attend the next city council meeting to keep an eye on any proposed changes. So I did. The city council meeting took place in an older municipal building with flickering fluorescent lights. When the public comment section began, I was ready. Sure enough, I spotted Karen among the attendees whispering with a group of individuals I didn't recognize. An agenda item titled "Street Improvement Proposal" eventually came up. A city engineer explained that the HOA submitted a request to consider a slight widening of the road near the intersection that happened to be right by my house. He cited community feedback about tight corners and difficulty navigating large vehicles. I nearly laughed aloud. Difficulty navigating a standard residential street? This had Karen's fingerprints all over it. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly outlined how this proposed widening seemed suspiciously targeted at my corner. I mentioned the ongoing dispute with the HOA and raised concerns about property rights. Karen feigned ignorance, claiming this plan had been in the works for months and had nothing to do with my personal issues. The city council members wore polite expressions, nodding but not fully committing. They tabled the decision, stating it needed more review. At least for the moment, that meant I had a reprieve, though Karen's attempt at remapping my boundary felt like an alarming escalation. This chain of events took a toll on me emotionally and psychologically. My once quiet life turned into a daily chess match, with each side maneuvering for an advantage. Friends outside the neighborhood were aghast when they heard the story. Some urged me to sell and move. But why should I abandon my home because of one power-tripping HOA officer? I resolved to stand firm. The principle mattered as much as the property. Weeks passed. The friction never fully abated, but there were signs Karen was losing ground. A few residents started speaking out against her after they saw how brazenly she behaved. One neighbor recounted how Karen had threatened them over a minor fence issue. Another described how she demanded they remove a decorative wreath that wasn't seasonally appropriate. Gradually, a small coalition formed, people who felt the HOA's regulations had gone too far under Karen's leadership. They began circulating a petition to remove her from the board. Meanwhile, her lawsuit threat hung in limbo. My lawyers surmised that she might be stalling because she lacked a strong case. Then, in a surprising turn, the city engineer concluded that a road expansion at that corner wasn't necessary nor cost-benefit. The official recommendation to the council was to deny the HOA's request. This was a huge blow to Karen's attempt at reclassification. She fired back with claims that the street was unsafe, referencing phantom complaints from residents. But none of those residents came forward publicly, which made the council wary of her claims. That same week, I received a letter from the HOA's legal counsel, this time more conciliatory. It stated they'd like to settle the matter of the lawn dispute amicably, that perhaps we could come to an arrangement about proper landscaping. I guessed that meant they saw the writing on the wall and wanted to avoid a messy court battle. During another HOA meeting, the tension reached a breaking point. Residents openly questioned Karen's motives, some even referencing her vendetta against me by name. She lashed out, insisting she was only upholding rules for the collective good. But the tide had turned. Martin, who previously avoided taking sides, announced that the board would review all fines issued in the past year to see if any were unfairly levied. Paula, shifting uncomfortably, added that they would also consider new oversight measures, so no single board member could arbitrarily impose penalties. Karen appeared livid. Her face tightened, and she argued that the board was being undermined. Yet the murmurs in the room indicated she was losing her grip. In the weeks that followed, my fines were formally rescinded. The threat of further HOA sanctions against me vanished. The special subcommittee concluded that the plastic ridges, while unusual, didn't violate any explicit rule as long as they remained fully on my private property. Meanwhile, Karen's personal threats quieted. The rumored lawsuit? It dissolved with no official filing. My lawyer told me Karen's attorney simply stopped responding after we presented our robust defense. The final blow came when the newly formed coalition of frustrated homeowners submitted enough signatures to force a recall vote on Karen's position. Fearing a humiliating public dismissal, she resigned from the board. Rumors circulated that she might move away, though I never confirmed it. Her brand new BMW eventually disappeared from the street, replaced by some other sedan parked in her driveway. I rarely saw her after that. Once I caught a glimpse of her at the grocery store, and she hurried down another aisle as soon as our eyes met. With Karen gone, the HOA leadership shifted toward a more moderate stance. They quietly shelved any notion of a road expansion, let alone any attempts to force me to remove the ridges. My lawn, though still scarred from months of tire damage, began to heal. I replanted sod, replaced the broken sprinkler, and adjusted my cameras to a less paranoid angle. I also found a sense of camaraderie among neighbors who had seen the fiasco unfold. People I'd barely spoken to before now greeted me warmly, joking about how I had liberated the neighborhood from tyranny. I didn't feel like a hero, just a homeowner who refused to be trampled, literally or figuratively. Now, every morning, I step outside and feel relief that the grass remains intact. No fresh tire marks, no revving engine at dawn. The plastic ridges are still there under the surface, a subtle reminder of how far I had to go to safeguard my property rights. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the street, half expecting that silver SUV to appear and barrel across my lawn again. But it never does. All that remains is the memory of a bizarre suburban battle, a testament to how unchecked power in the hands of a petty individual can wreak havoc on an entire community. The scars in my yard are faded now, both physically and emotionally. I've since come to appreciate how these conflicts reveal deeper truths. At first glance, it seemed like a trivial matter, someone driving across a patch of grass. Yet behind it lay issues of authority, personal vendettas, manipulation of rules, and the willingness of bystanders to remain silent. Once enough neighbors realized that complacency only emboldened the abuser, we collectively turned the tide. The downfall of Karen wasn't just about stopping her from messing with my lawn. It was about rebalancing the power so that no single person's arrogance could dominate the entire HOA. On occasional nights, I think about the guilt I felt installing those ridges. I wonder if there had been a gentler resolution. Then I recall her absolute disregard for my appeals, the fines levied against me for her own destruction, the letters threatening legal ruin. Perhaps it would have spiraled out of control regardless. At least the final outcome reaffirmed an important principle. Nobody has the right to use another person's property as they please, no matter their position in a homeowners association. And if someone tries, you can stand firm and fight back. Sometimes you even prevail. The lawn looks normal now. You'd hardly guess what happened, but if you walk across that corner, you might feel a slight bump beneath your feet, where the ridges still lie hidden. It always makes me smile. A small victory embedded under the grass. I've thought about removing them, but a part of me wants them to remain as a quiet statement. Don't ever think you can tread on someone's home without consequences. It's a reminder of how critical it is to protect your space, both physically and metaphorically. A reminder that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show you aren't afraid to push back. Months after Karen's departure from the board, the atmosphere in our neighborhood feels brighter. People are more open about raising concerns. The new HOA leadership seems genuinely interested in community welfare rather than power trips. Residents have started to see me not just as that guy with the messed up lawn, but as a person who challenged an unjust system. Occasionally, a neighbor will ask for advice about a minor dispute, and I find myself chuckling at the role reversal. I'm far from an expert, but I do know how vital it is to document everything and unite with others who face similar issues. That's often the key to unraveling intimidation, shining enough light so that those who operate in the shadows can't hide behind bureaucratic smokescreens. One crisp autumn morning, I was raking leaves near the mailbox when Martin, the HOA president, passed by with his dog. He stopped to chat, praising how nice the lawn looked. He expressed regret about how poorly the board handled things under Karen's influence. He didn't exactly apologize for his earlier inaction, but I detected a hint of remorse in his tone. He mentioned that the board was revising some rules to ensure no single person could manipulate the system again. I appreciated his honesty. People can be slow to challenge authority, especially when they believe it's for the greater good. It's easy to overlook abuses until they land right on your front lawn, leaving giant tire marks behind. I've shared my story with friends who live in other neighborhoods, some with HOAs, some without. Many laughed, finding the entire saga bizarre. Others shook their heads in sympathy, confessing they too had encountered small tyrannies in their communities. For me, the lesson is clear. Fight injustice on a local level before it grows, whether it's an HOA official misusing rules or a neighbor who thinks they're above the law. These issues reflect bigger societal patterns. If we don't speak up, they fester. If we do speak up, we might face pushback, but sometimes we spark change. Sitting on my porch swing one evening, I gazed across the freshly trimmed grass, the quiet street bathed in a soft glow from the street lamps. I thought back to all the early mornings I'd bolted out of bed in a fury, the heated confrontations, the uneasy nights worrying about lawsuits. Now, that storm had passed. My property felt like my own again. The quiet was no longer ominous. It was simply peaceful. When neighbors strolled by, they'd wave and smile. A couple of kids zoomed down the sidewalk on bikes, laughing as if the concept of an HOA feud was unimaginable. Life moved on. My front yard had been a battlefield, but it was also a place that ultimately reaffirmed my faith in standing one's ground. I find it interesting how a patch of grass could become a symbol for personal rights, how it could draw out the best and worst sides of a neighborhood. That corner by the mailbox, once covered in muddy ruts, now hosts a small rock garden. I added a couple of decorative stones around the perimeter, partly to discourage future trespassers, partly as a subtle homage to the strife I endured. Each stone is etched with simple phrases like respect, boundaries, and community. Maybe it's a bit sentimental, maybe it's just a conversation starter for visitors who ask, "Why do you have those particular words on those rocks?" Then I get to share the short version of my story, how an HOA official named Karen tried to treat my lawn like her private driveway, and how I refused to let it continue. People often chuckle or shake their heads in disbelief. Still, not everything is perfect. The HOA remains an organization with broad authority. Disputes arise, but at least the board members now practice more transparency. I keep my cameras in place, though I rarely check them. Habits formed under duress are hard to break. If a random car crosses my grass again, I'll be ready with both technology and a willingness to defend my rights. Yet I sincerely hope it never comes to that. Let the ridges lie hidden, waiting, a quiet deterrent beneath the earth. On some nights, I recall the moment I considered removing those plastic strips for good. My lawyer had mentioned that now that the direct threat was gone, it might be wise to avoid any appearance of entrapment. But eventually he conceded that so long as they pose no genuine danger to lawful foot traffic or public roads, I'm within my rights to keep them. And so they remain, covered in layers of well-groomed grass. They're a piece of my personal history and a testament to the fact that with enough perseverance and yes, a little cunning, you can stand up to an overzealous HOA figure. I can't say I'm friends with Karen now, nor do I expect to be. I learned she hasn't actually moved away, but she stays clear of me in any official neighborhood functions. Some say she still harbors bitterness, believing I wronged her by exposing her behavior. Yet the broader neighborhood sees it differently. They view it as a necessary confrontation that cleanses the board of toxic leadership. I try not to dwell on her personal feelings. My energy is better spent maintaining a positive relationship with the rest of the community, ensuring no one else finds themselves cornered by manipulative rules. Occasionally, a new resident arrives and they ask me about the rumors of someone burying spikes in their yard to stop cars. I give them the abbreviated version, mindful not to seem like I'm bragging. The truth stands. I did what was needed to keep my lawn and my rights intact. Sure, it was unorthodox, but so was the situation. If I'd done nothing, Karen might have run me over, in the metaphorical sense, piling on fines and controlling the narrative until she had me cornered. Instead, I discovered how to fight back, using my wits, the law, and the solidarity of neighbors who refuse to let injustice stand. All things considered, I'm grateful I never caved. My story might sound extreme, yet it underscores how easily an abuse of authority can flourish in a small-scale environment if no one challenges it. Even a homeowner's front yard can become a battleground for principle. Now, standing here, I can breathe freely, knowing that my patch of grass is once again just a patch of grass, not a symbol of conflict, not a setting for midnight sabotage. Just the front yard of a home where I can sip my morning coffee and enjoy the quiet. And if a certain silver BMW ever tries to trespass again, well, those subtle ridges are waiting to make sure she thinks twice.